figure out where we need to go. So I'm going to skip over his his information, just so you know a little bit about me and Group One. You know, we've been around for this is our 35th year, and I have been doing this for way too long, but about 25 or 26, and have worked with the Interlogix product going way back, both the video that we're going to talk about today, as well as the access control, the intrusion, and we're happy to help with systems design and also technical help. When I do need help, we might end up at the Interlogix tech support, but I can be a pretty good point person for some of that. We're going to go through the recorder programming and installation. This is going to be both for the TVI, which is your HD over Coax, where you can get the 1080p or even higher resolutions over Coax, as well as the TVN 10, which is the IP setup. The programming, the nice thing about Interlogix is the programming is almost identical for both. So you have a very common interface, and there's a few differences between the two, and I'll point them out when we hit there. But for the most part, the programming for each type of camera are the same, and I believe that you guys have used both types, so both of these things will be relevant. Basically, this is just a slide telling you what we're going to do, and essentially we're just going to go through setting it up. And one thing to touch on, I stick to what I call the 95% programming. There's probably 80 to 100 menu items that you might get into when doing a program like this, but in 95% of your installations, you're never going to touch most of those menu items. So I stick to the menu items that you're going to need for most of your jobs, and some of the lesser known menu items, you kind of can hit those as you are setting up systems. So I will kind of go by and we won't really touch on a lot of those. And if there's something specific that you have wondered about or needed to know, let me know and we can hit those specifically. But in general, I'm going to stick to 95% of your installs, get the cameras up and running, get them recording the way you want, and get the customer remote access to the system. Because in most jobs, that is everything that people want. So I'm not going to get into the weeds too much unless you guys have specific questions. So one thing, and this is the first of the slides that really isn't relevant at this point, other than it still gives you an idea of the types of systems, but don't pay attention necessarily as much to these part numbers because they are all changing, but you can get an idea of how these systems go together. This is the IP system, and the TVN 10 is still a good system part number. At some point, I expect it to become a TVN 11, but I don't have information on that yet. The TVN 10 is your basic IP setup. It comes in a 4, 8, or 16 camera system. The one point that you need to know about is even on the 16 channel system, you still only have 8 ports of PoE. So any of the additional cameras need to be put into the system either over the network, or you need a separate PoE switch to power those up. It has the least amount of throughput, and the throughput is how much you can record, how many frames per second, etc. And the hard drives are all fixed. So you buy a 2 terabyte, that's what you get. You're not adding terabytes to the system. And there's also no additional storage. So whatever you're getting, that's what you're set up as. The TVN 21 series, these three here, those are now TVN 22s. The S means that it has built-in PoE switch. So, and this one you have a PoE switch for every camera. So if it's a 16 channel recorder, you have 16 PoE ports on the back. The 22 is just a basic server for sitting in a rack. And then the 22P is the same thing, but with enhanced bandwidth. So you have more throughput, and you have additional channel sizes like up to 32. All of these recorders have a flip down lid that you can add hard drives. So if you buy a 4 terabyte, you can add a 6 terabyte extra drive or a 4 terabyte extra drive to get yourself up to much larger storage solutions. You also have some things like NAS that you could do network attached storage, and it's got an eSATA port for like another type of additional storage. So there's a couple ways you can get much bigger storage if you have, I'm not sure actually, quite frankly, what the rules are in Alaska as far as some of the marijuana stuff, if they've got some of the rules that we have down here, but some of those can get into very heavy hard drive requirements because of the length of time you need to store video. So that's kind of your mid-grade of the recorders. And then your TVN 70 is on this is actually now a 71, and it actually goes up to 586 megabits per second. So that gets into your big systems, 100 cameras, 90 cameras, that type of thing. You do not have a video output on the TVN 71. So this truly is an appliance where you stick it in a server rack and everything you do with it is accessed through software. These four, the TVN 10 plus all the 22s, those all have an HDMI out that you can run to a local monitor, and you could do everything from the face of the unit as well as through the networking. That's the basics on the layout of the IP recorders. Oh shoot, gotta switch this. Then you've got the hybrid recorders, which are your HD-TVI that allow for high definition over coax. These recorders, these have all changed, these part numbers. So we are now looking at a TVR 15 HD. The only reason this has a C is because it's a compact housing rather than the full size, but these are basically the same recorder. 4, 8, or 16 channel. One thing they've changed from the 12 to the 15 is that now any channel could be IP. So while you have a maximum of 4, 8, or 16 channels, you could do any mixture of analog, TVI, or IP on those systems. You just can't go over the total number of channels. Your full 1080p resolution is now bumped up to 30 frames per second, and so you can do 1080p at real time. Again, the TVR 15s are kind of like the 10s where your storage is fixed. So whatever hard drive size you get, that's where you are. The TVR 44, this is actually now a 45, and you can expand your storage. That's really what the advantage is. You have a little bit more bandwidth in case you want to do some more IP, but you have some expansion capabilities. This gets into some real detailed specs that I'm not going to bother with since all of these numbers have changed a little bit since with the new part numbers. But as far as additional information, the Interlogix website is good. You can go to video and recorders and see all the current recorders plus kind of the one older version just so that you can get some information. Definitely you can give us a call anytime. We can kind of help walk through what the best recorder is for your application, as well as our website has a little, we're in the middle of redesigning it, but right now there's a spot on there called that says shop now, and if you go to that portion of the website you can actually see what recorders we have in stock, and from the link to each of those recorders you can also get data sheets, user manuals, install manuals, all the documentation that you might need. Lastly, as far as information, we are slowly adding different videos for different things that you might need to do with your recorder. So we've got a little video online right now for updating firmware. We have a video for how to activate cameras, which we'll go through in this training. And there's a couple other videos, and we're trying to add more every day as far as different things that you might be interested in just a small snippet of this training, making little 1 and 2 minute videos. So that's on a YouTube channel, and that's also under the Group 1 NW if you're looking for that, and there is a link to it on our website. So getting to the installation for this for the walkthrough, I'm going to use a TVN 10, which is the IP version. I have a TVR 15, which is your HD-TVI online, and so I may pop into that to show you a little bit of the differences, but for the most part, we'll walk through the TVN 10. As I mentioned, your interface is going to be the same. There might be just very minor changes, and there's about 2 or 3 things that are different, and I'll point out those as we come to them. What I've done on our system here is I've gotten a TVN 10 that I have rebooted to factory default. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to it using the computer here, and I'll bring up the software so you can see it. And what we're going to do is get it set up with just a laptop. So you can do this without a local monitor on your unit. And this helps you get the right IP address so that it's in your subnet of your local installation. And you can change the IP address and then get the cameras up and running. So as far as the first thing you're doing is you're connecting the TVN 10 to the network, the local network that you're working on, and then we will connect the IP cameras that maybe are not plugged into the back of the recorder, and this would be the same thing if you were using an HD-TVI, since that can take IP cameras but it does not have POV ports. You would have to hang those cameras onto a network, and then you can point to them and record them that way. Lastly, we're going to plug in cameras that are actually plugged into the PoE on the back of the recorder, and then we're going to connect to the device with the laptop, and we'll walk through the setup. So the first software that we're going to go through, there's actually 3 pieces of software that we'll go through. There's Device Manager, there's TVN Calculator, and then there's TruVision Navigator, which is the end user software that they'll use to view it. And Device Manager is really a tool for you, the installer. It's not something that the end user is ever going to use. But what it does is it actually is looking for the MAC address of TruVision devices. And so the benefit here is if your installation is going into an application where they use a 192.168.10, or actually I guess the one I'm using here is a .2 something. That's my subnet for my local demo area. I can find a TruVision recorder even if it's not in that subnet, which is important when you go into installations where you're not sure what that installation is. You need to be able to set the address into their network. It's not a routable signal, so if you do have a system with split network like I have here, I actually have a demo area and then I have a business area. Those are 2 different networks. I cannot find cameras across those routers because there is an actual router in between the 2 areas. So as long as you don't have a router between it, it'll find Interlogix products that are hardwired into a network without regard to what their actual IP address is. Using this software, we can then set the IP address to what we want it to be so that we can then access the system normally through a browser. These are just some graphics showing as long as the system's not through a router, you'll be able to see cameras and recorders that are on the same network regardless of their IP address. This is just showing when you have a router, you can only see the green and not the yellow. Now, here's where we're going to kind of split up a little bit. So just a little bit of history. About a year ago, there was a pretty bad cyber attack on security cameras in general. And one of the things that they did is they basically used default username and passwords to take over about 200,000 to 300,000 security cameras that were out there that had never been moved off their default password. And when they did that, they turned it into a DDoS attack and took down one of the biggest DNS servers that was feeding Facebook and Google and all sorts of people that were down for like half a day and caused major chaos. So one of the things that Interlogix has done to combat that is they have gone to a situation where they are now requiring cameras to be activated, cameras and recorders. prior to being used. So there is no default username and password in these boxes now. And this goes for new firmware recorders and newer cameras. There's still a ton of legacy cameras and existing cameras that are not the newer versions that don't need activation yet, but moving forward, everything will need to go through this process. So that's not on this presentation at all. So I will get into Device Manager once I figure out how to switch this around. Okay, so now you see the startup page for Device Manager. And you can see right away, the first thing you see is this Activate Device cube, and there's a yellow circle that says 1 in it. That tells me that I have one device on the network that needs to be activated before it can be used. Device Discovery is the standard part of Device Manager that shows you all the Interlogix stuff that's on this network. I have a bunch of stuff because this is my demo area. As you can see, everything is in a 192.168.2 subnet, but this one recorder. So here's that TVN 10. You can see it's got the little icon saying that it requires activation, and it's also in this is its default address, which is a 1.82. Well, that's not going to work on my network because I'm a .2. So first thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to activate this recorder, and I'm going to need to change the IP address to something that I can use, which is going to be a .2. So let's see. I want to go back to the home page. So from here, if you know you have devices to activate, I can just click on the activate device, and it's going to bring up a new window with only the devices that it knows need to be activated. So here's my TVN 10. We see that it requires activation. I am going to activate it and set the IP address all at the same time. You could, if the IP address didn't need to be changed, you could just activate it by adding a username and password. So click the box to select this recorder, and I am going to keep it simple and just make it a 2.82 instead of a 1.82. So that'll put it inside my subnet. And you'll notice right over here, it's already checked and decided, yes, that IP address is available. That's kind of nice when you're on a network that you don't really know what's going on. You don't have to worry about stumbling on top of somebody else's IP address. Change my gateway to the router, and now I need to activate it. So I need to give it, the username is going to be admin, and now I need to give it a password. It will not accept something like 1234 because the whole point is to be a little bit more secure. So I'm going to do something that's a mix of letters and numbers, and you can do a mix with capitals or non-capitals, etc. So I have dealers do one of two things. They either use a password that has something to do with the client, or they have some sort of common password that they're using as an integrator, or they do something random where they actually just document it for each customer. Once I've got my activation done in my passwords and I've got my IP address set to where I want it, then I just hit apply. That thing will process through, and it should come up. Oh, there we go. So unable to change the IP address. So let me see what's going on. Try this again here. There we go. I'm not sure what I did the first time. I think I may have gotten the, I think I may have mistyped in the when I confirmed the password. So now you can see the requires activation is gone, and my IP address is now an address that's inside my subnet, so I can hit this recorder separately. Briefly, here's the other device discovery. This is the back to the part of Device Manager. This is used when you're troubleshooting a lot, where if you have a camera that you're not sure why it's not coming up on your recorder, if you can hit the camera with Device Manager, we know the networking is working. And then you can check your IP address and see if there might be something else going on, like a port has been changed or something along that nature. The other place where this would work well is if you have one of those bigger systems, 40, 50 cameras, and the cameras are on separate switches. So you're using like a TVN 71 as your recorder. Device Manager allows you to plug all those cameras in, and even though they all have the same default IP address, you could come in here and you could select multiple cameras. I'm just going to pick a couple random here, and you could go to change IP address. And now I could highlight all these cameras, and whatever I type as the first IP address, it will recommend switching the IP address consecutively. So if I wanted to go to 192.168.2.60, you'll see here it's going to want to change this to 60, 61, 62, and it's checking that the IP is available every time. So that allows you to take a system with 40, 50 cameras and set all the IP addresses very quickly and easily without having to go into each camera separately. I'm not going to make that change, but that's the simplicity of Device Manager, is being able to connect to things without actually knowing their IP address ahead of time. I'm going to pop back in here. This Device Manager, it does all the same things, but it's the older version, so the pictures don't look the same. This I'm going to just kind of pass through and just make sure I hit all the high points. So here's changing the IP address, changing the password. This is just going into setting it, bulk address. We just went through that. Again, this just looks a little different, but it all does the same stuff. So we've now set it up, and we've got the unit in our network so that we know what we're doing. And now to program it, we're going to connect with a browser. With the systems that you've done, you've probably gotten used to this by now. Internet Explorer is the only browser that supports plugins right now. They are in the process of updating all of their web type applications, but we're still probably a couple months away at least to where they're trying to get it to where it's a plug-in free setup so that you can use other browsers. Right now it's Internet Explorer, and quite frankly, it's Internet. Microsoft tries to protect you from a lot of things, and so you typically have to add the site into a trusted site and or set the compatibility view on Internet Explorer to get it to connect properly. So the first time you try to connect, it can be cumbersome, like with a customer's computer. But once you get that connected, it typically will remember all those things, and so then those plugins and things will run properly the next time. But that first time, you do have to add some plugins and kind of mess around with it a little bit. The other thing is I have tested, and for the most part, it works really well. There is a extension that you can add to Chrome called IE Tab. I'm just going to put that down here in the chat box here. It's called IE Tab, all one word, no spaces, and that basically mimics Internet Explorer but inside of Chrome. So if you have a customer that wants to use Chrome as their browser, you can set the IE Tab extension, and that way when they go to their recorder, instead of going into native Chrome, it'll actually go into this IE Tab and allow those plugins to run so that everything works properly. Okay, so now we're talking about logging into the unit. I'm going to go through these slides really quick, probably quicker than we need, and then I'm going to go actually do it on the unit that I just set up, just so we can actually do it on a live unit. So the default username and password is actually now non-existent because we had to activate and assign it our own address. So now we're going to be using that password that we just used to activate the unit. This is what the browser looks like, and basically there's a configuration tab which gets you into all of the networks, the settings. So the first thing you're going to do when you get into these things is make sure that the network settings are all set. When you're using Device Manager, all you have is your IP address and your gateway, which is only part of your network setup. So you want to make sure to fill in the rest. And one of the most important ones is DNS server, because there are three things that the unit will need to translate from name to address. And one of them will actually have to do with those push notifications that you guys wanted to know about through the app. The other one is your network time protocol. And then the last one is DDNS so that you can connect up when somebody has a dynamic address. All those things need a DNS server. What I usually do is just what they show here, which is use the Google one because it's very easy to remember, which is 8.8.8.8. You can use any DNS service. So if the customer's IPs have one, if it's a corporate customer and they say, hey, we use X for all of our DNS, they may have a process. By all means, use their stuff. This is just easy to remember, and you do want to make sure you have something in on your DNS information. Next thing is setting the time and date. This is basically like a VCR. I mean, just set your time and date. What I would always do once you set your time and date is set up your NTP. This makes sure that your time and date is not going to float on you. It'll check in every hour and it'll adjust to an NTP server. Quite frankly, again, if you had a corporate customer that used a specific time server so that all of their networking products were on the same time server, you can do that. But I never change this. I basically just come in here, click enable, and it'll go to the default piece. Let me now get my browser going. And I will share it here in just a second. Let's see. All right, so that should be up shared. So I now go to my 192.168.2.82, which is the IP address that we set for that recorder. And now here's my login screen. So admin is the username. Password is the one that I use to activate. And I log in and I get this screen that you saw before. Oh, and there I am. So when we hit configuration, now we're into that networking setup. So to walk through kind of the things that wait a minute. Oh, there we go. Sorry, it said that it stopped sharing my screen. So when we go into the network pieces, here's all our settings, network settings. So here are those settings that we set with the with Device Manager, but as you see, the DNS servers come up blank. So I'm going to put those Google ones in. And really important on your setup, especially depending on what the size of screen you're using, get down to the bottom of every page and make sure you save it. If I popped out of here without saving it, those DNS servers are going to be gone. And unfortunately, it does not give you any kind of a prompt like, hey, are you sure you want to leave this screen? You have unsaved items. It doesn't really prompt you that way. So you do have to remember that save button. So that's we went through the network settings, time and date, came up Pacific time, let's see, 3/6/11:43, that's pretty close to where we are now. I'm actually going to set the auto daylight savings time just so that I know that it will adjust when we hit that next week. Again, I hit the save, And then lastly, you're going to go into this NTP. And again, I don't make any changes to this. I just enable it and save it. So now this thing will save its time and it'll connect up. One thing that we're not really going to go into today, but we could talk about at some point, is when you use the TruPortal, which is the Interlogix access control system, that NTP becomes very important, because as long as you sync the access control and the video, then you can do integration very reasonably priced between access and video. And that's how the integration works, is by keeping those times synced up. That's your basic setup to just get things going. And after that, we're going to get into the cameras. Let me get back over here. So adding cameras. So on the TVN 10, you can add cameras that are just network cameras that are sitting on the customer's network. And then you also have the cameras that you can actually plug into the back of the recorder and use the PoE to connect up. And they're called plug and play, because when you plug them in, they will essentially auto discover and get themselves set up. So kind of going to go through a little bit of both here. Actually pop over to configuration page. So I keep IP camera status. I know you saw the picture of me when I pulled up this the video first. I forgot to unplug those cameras when I defaulted them. So I've unplugged them now. So at this point we have a recorder with no cameras on it. From here, if I had cameras sitting on the network, they weren't getting plugged into the back, they were just sitting out on my network and I needed to go find them, this is sort of like Device Manager. If I go to search, it's going to go out and it's going to find Interlogix products that are on my network that I could add. You can see I've got TruVision cameras. I also have some cameras that are not Interlogix, that are actually on VIF, which is a standardization that I could try to add to the system. I have decent success with OnVIF and Interlogix recorders, but it is not something that you want to bank on working with every camera. You really want to test that out before you tell someone that you can use their existing cameras, or if you find a specialty IP camera that you're thinking, hey, I'd really like to use that, you definitely want to test it, because while OnVIF standard will probably mean that you'll be able to get video, some features may or may not work. It's not a universal standard. So some I've had where the video works, but motion detection doesn't work. I've also had it where motion detection works, but you're not able to change your frame rate based on motion. So all it does is just kind of flag it as motion. So there's a couple different things that you want to test out and make sure it's going to work for your application before you plan on using an OnVIF camera. Basically, all I'd need to do to add one of these cameras is check the box, add it, and then I can go in and add the username and password so that it can talk to that camera, and then I'm up and running. So that's a way to add cameras outside of the actual network. I'm not going to actually add one right now. I'm going to leave this blank. But that's the basics of setting up external cameras. Now, as far as the majority of these cameras, you're going to plug them into the back of a recorder, and they're going to basically become plug and play. I have two cameras here that I'm going to plug in, and you'll see them kind of come up online as they basically discover themselves and then start to program themselves. A couple notes that I like to point out to people. If I plugged in the very first camera into slot number 3 on the back of the recorder, that camera would still come up as camera 1, even though it would say POV 3, meaning POV port 3. In my mind, it doesn't really matter from a use standpoint. However, I find it's the type of thing that when you come back 6 months, 8 months, 2 years later, when the customer asks you to make some change, or maybe they did something and something stopped working and you got to troubleshoot, it's not easy when you're seeing camera 1 and yet port 3 is unplugged. So you usually want to match those things up. So what I recommend doing is if you're going to add cameras 1 and 2, I would say plug it into camera 1 first, plug it into camera 2 second, so that those cameras come up in the order that you would be expecting. I'm just kind of hitting this refresh button. You can see camera 1 has come up. It first says it's offline. Now I refreshed again. Camera 1 is actually online. Camera 2 has come up and it is offline. So it slowly comes on. My screen, there we go. It slowly comes on, and then pretty soon they both get online. Usually it takes anywhere from about 2 to 4 minutes, and they will be up and running. This is what I was talking about here. You've got D1, which is camera 1, and then POE1, meaning it's plugged into port 1. I always like to match those up. As I said, I just find it to be much more straightforward if you're coming back later, or especially if a different tech comes out and starts looking at it. It just makes it much easier for everybody. Very important here. These things will plug in. They auto configure. They give them an IP address. They set them up to start recording. But the default is probably not the way you want them to record. They default at 720p, 30 frames per second all the time. Most people want to bump the resolution up because most cameras are now 2 and 4 megapixels, so you want to take advantage of that, as well as most people don't want to record at 30 frames per second because it just chews up so much hard drive and so much bandwidth that you need to reduce that a little bit so that you can actually get some longevity with your recordings. But the other thing that they do is this is all automatic. It's all plug and play. It sees these cameras as new cameras and sets them all up. The downside is if I leave them in plug and play mode, if I lose power, or if somebody decides they want to unplug a wire and move it because they want to switch where it's run and they want to plug it back in, each time you either lose power or unplug it, it's going to see those cameras as brand new cameras. And it's going to say, hey, I found a camera, and it's going to go through this same configuration process. When that happens, you lose any configuration that you've done. So when we get done here, we will have programmed these cameras. You want to make sure that programming stays and you don't have to redo it later. So what you want to do with each of these cameras is after it's up and running and you have video, select the camera and go to modify. You can see here it says plug and play, and all this information is basically grayed out. All you need to do is switch that to manual and then type in the password. These are older cameras, so these still have the 1, 2, 3, 4 as the default. If you've changed it, great, use the current password, but basically once you switch it to manual, you have to tell it what the password is. You'll notice that when I hit OK, oops, there we go. It drops off for a second, and I'm going to just keep hitting refresh here. It takes maybe 30 seconds. It will then bring itself back up online. Now it is in manual. So now if I make any changes to this, configuration changes, name the camera, etc., now, if the system loses power or if this camera gets unplugged, when it gets plugged back in, it's going to say, hey, I know what that camera is. That's this camera right here, and you're not going to lose any of your programming. So I'm going to go into camera 2, switch that to manual, password, hit OK. That'll come back up. Sorry, I gotta jump back here and see how we're doing here. So we talked about finding cameras that are displayed. I'm going to catch myself up here. We went through this. This is the setting up on the POV ports. They'll come up online. Here's the part about setting them to manual. That's a really important thing that a lot of people either didn't understand kind of when they first started installing them, or just didn't know, and so they left them as plug and play. And then when their system lost power, they've lost all sorts of programming. So that's probably one of the key things of setting these things up. We went through the modify. So now we've got cameras. We've got 2 cameras set up, and now it's really a matter of how do you want to record these so that the customer's happy with what they're going to get. They get the right amount of time that they want to have it be recorded for, and they also have motion activation, so they have triggers and they can see what's going on. I kind of think of the setup on the camera recordings is kind of a 3-step setup. You're really setting up how you want each type of recording to be recorded, how many frames per second, the resolution, the quality. Then you're setting up when you want each piece to activate. This is the schedule. And then you're setting up motion detection. Most systems are going to have motion detection of some type, and you'll set that up. And so that's kind of your 3 steps for getting the recording the way you want. The recording settings, there's actually essentially 5 modes. There's time-lapse high, time-lapse low. For our purposes, because of kind of, again, trying to treat this as the 95% of your applications, you're really only going to use time-lapse high. You may come up with a reason for having time-lapse low. What that means is that's just a different time-lapse speed, and you can control that with the schedule. I don't know if I ever have anybody using that. The next stream is your event, and this is how fast you want it to record and how and what quality when there's motion detected on a camera. That's your event. The next one is alarm, and that's when you actually have a hardwired trigger. So you could do a doorbell, you could do an alarm system so that the system, maybe a panic button, something that causes it to go into alarm on a proactive basis that you are actually triggering the recorder using wire. And then lastly, you have your SubStream, which this is a lower resolution image, and this is used when you are connecting with your app online, especially like when your app's not on Wi-Fi. You want to use the SubStream so that it's a much lower bandwidth and you get a better connection without having being slowed down by the network. Before we get into this, I'm gonna switch around a little bit here and get into one of the second pieces of software that we talked about. This is called the TVN Calculator. And this is a tool that I literally use every single day. I get calls all the time. Somebody calls me, they say, hey, I want to use an 8-channel recorder. I want to record 5 2-megapixel cameras, and my customer needs it to go 2 weeks. I can use this software to figure out either how many frames per second they can get to get 2 weeks, or what size hard drive do they need to buy to make sure they get 2 weeks. And then you can start playing with the numbers to see how you're going to satisfy the customer. So if I'm going to do 5 cameras, that means I'm going to have an 8-channel recorder. For this purposes, I'm going to choose a TVN 10. And say they've got 4 meg. I know I said 2 megapixel, but say they got 4 megapixel cameras, and they're really worried about motion. They want 15 frames per second across all their cameras. The quality on this calculator is defaulted at medium, but most people are going to say, hey, I want the highest quality I can get. So I've got my 4 megapixel camera, 15 frames per second, highest quality, and I'm going to copy it to these five cameras. First thing you notice, or hopefully you notice, is this red exclamation point down here. So the 8-channel TVN 10 here has 40 megabits of total throughput. And with 5 cameras at 4 megapixel at 15 frames per second, I'm actually trying to use 50. So I've got basically too much recording going on this recorder. So I've got a couple options, and this is where I use this software. Do you want to lower your resolution? Do you want to lower your frame rate? Do you want to lower your quality? Or you could increase the channels on your recorder. I could go to a 16-channel recorder and do this setup, and I will have plenty of bandwidth. That's one piece that you need to use and figure out, make sure that you've got the right sized recorder for the application. The second thing is how long you want to record for. If you look, I've got this set for, this defaults at 30 days, but if I go back to my example and I say, hey, I want 14 days of recording, it says I need 7 terabytes. Well, the 8-channel TVN 10, the maximum is actually 4 terabyte. And I will get in that resolution and quality here in just a second. That'll follow. So I will get to that as part of this. But so now I have to decide again, how do I want to lower this? So I say, okay, you know what? They're willing to go to 10 frames per second instead of 15, and you'll see all these numbers start changing. And you know, by going to 10, now I'm within my 40 megabits, and I'm really close to 4 terabytes. And maybe the customer says, you know what? That's good enough. With 4 terabytes, you're going to be down around 11 days. Or you'll notice here, this is saying 100% motion. So I say, well, you know, that one is my front door, and it's a kind of a closed off area, and no one is there most of the time. You may not have a lot of activity. So you may say, when there's motion, I'm going to do 10 frames per second, but when there is no motion, we're going to drop that down to, say, 2 frames per second. That will increase your length of time. So now you might hit that 2 weeks. So that's this is that software package that's usually going to be used pre-sale, system design. You know, you set yourself up for how you're going to set up that system. The second thing that I like this for is from a sales perspective. If you're dealing with a customer that you've kind of walked the thing and they say, hey, I got six cameras, and you have this all dialed out, you can name the cameras here, front door, etc. Pick your resolution, your frame rate. You see that you're going to get 11 days, and you can actually print this report. Let's see, I don't know, I don't think it's sharing that right now. How do I do this? Hopefully you can see this, but it basically shows a page that shows your bit rate, shows the storage required, shows how many days you're going to be able to keep this, and it shows each camera and the resolution. And so the nice thing from a sales perspective is this kind of shows your customer that you have taken the time to actually think about this, and it's not just throwing 6 cameras against, you know, in the system and saying, hey, great, here you go. And so it gives that little bit of professionalism for your quotes, showing that you've kind of walked through it. The second thing it does is kind of cover you. So when you have that conversation and they say, hey, I want 2 weeks, and you go through, okay, we're going to do 10 frames per second, we're going to do all these things, and then during the install they come back and they say, you know what, we changed our mind, we want to go 15 frames per second, and then they call you and they say, hey, we're not getting 2 weeks, and you have this document basically saying, well, we talked about it, you get 2 weeks if you do 10 frames per second, but we've now changed these, and so you're gonna have to give it up somewhere else if you really want to get back to that 2 weeks. But that way you kind of have some documentation of what your initial conversation is as far as how that system's going to get set up. So this software is downloadable from Interlogix website. I'm actually going to pull up, I'm going to show you where that is, if I can get to it. There we go. So here's Interlogix website. The best place to get the TVN calculator is go to video, go to recorders, and you'll see all the different recorders. Here you got your 15 and your 22. Here's the new 71. If I go to the newest recorder, this, no, that one's too new. They haven't added it yet. I'm going to go to the 15 because I know it's there. So if you go to one of these recorders under the download section, you'll see Storage and Bandwidth Calculator. That's the software that you were just looking at. So you can download that. It's just a really small file. It's really just an Excel spreadsheet with a fancy skin on it, so that you can, so that it does all the calculations. But it is a very good tool to have. And like I said, I get asked about length of time. It's going to record all the time. So that is a very common thing, and it's something you'll end up using a lot. The reason I wanted to go through this is the information that we're going to program into the recorder as far as resolution, frame rate, and quality. Kind of getting to your question about quality, and I think there might be a slide on this, but your resolution is just the number of pixels. The quality refers to the amount of compression. So I can record a 4 megapixel image, and it's got 4 million pixels, but if I go to a medium quality, there is a little bit more compression in the video, that it's not going to be quite as crisp, even though there is every pixel. And so it's a little bit, the higher the compression, the lower the quality means the higher the compression, so it uses smaller file sizes. And if you have a lot of motion with a lower quality, then it will look a little bit more pixelated, a little more blurry, because it's basically it's trying to compress too much. In a system without a lot of motion, a lower quality actually will still look pretty decent, because it doesn't need as much bandwidth the way that the H.264 encoding works. It takes more bandwidth the more motion there is. So I hope that kind of helps. Unfortunately, I can't give you a quantitative information about quality. It's kind of low to highest, and you kind of got to play with it a little bit to see how low you can go while still being content with how it looks. Resolution is a fixed thing. It's the number of pixels you have. Quality is a little more fluid as far as how the compression works. Switch this here. So the key here is, we're back to this camera recording settings, and I'll go onto the recorder and show this in just a second. But the key here is you are telling the recorder what to do when it is in one of these modes. You are not actually putting it in this mode. So I've had people call me and they say, okay, they go to camera 1, they go to mainstream event, thinking that they are putting that camera into event mode, meaning in terms of motion. And you're not. Really, all you're doing is saying, when it's in time-lapse mode, do this, and when it's in event mode, do something different. And then later on, we're going to tell it how to get into those modes. I'm going to jump back to the programming. So in the camera setup, there's camera recording. There we go. Camera recording settings. So here's that screen that you were just looking at. So you've got IP camera 1 and 2. There are 2 choices. Each camera can be done completely independent. So you could have one camera that you want to record 10 frames per second. You could have another one that you only want to record 2. Totally independent the way you set it up. This is one of the biggest differences between the TVI recorders and the IP recorders. Once I set a resolution in time-lapse high, so here's TL high, I'm going to set this to 1280 by 960. Just so you know, this demo unit that I use is actually an old demo unit that uses older cameras that don't even do 2 megapixel, which is why I don't have those as an option. The recorder will listen and see, we'll actually talk to the cameras to figure out what resolutions they actually have capable. All the current ones are now either 2 or 4 megapixel. These were old 1.3 megapixel cameras. That's why the resolution is lower. But once I set that to a resolution and save it, gotta wait for it to save here. There we go. So we got the save successful. When I go to my other modes like event and motion, you'll see this is grayed out because in IP cameras, I cannot change the resolution on the fly. I can't change it from D1 to 1.3 megapixel. Once you set the resolution, that's where it's set. TVI, you actually could. So your time lapse on a TVI could be very basic. It could be like a D1 resolution, which is very low bandwidth and relatively low resolution. But when there is motion, it can then jump up to 1080p because it's streaming the highest resolution all the time over the coax, and the recorder is just choosing how to record it. Whereas in the IP world, the camera is actually streaming a certain resolution. And if you were to try to switch from a time lapse to a motion and switch your resolution, it actually requires the camera to stop encoding and then start up again in the new format. And it can't do it quick enough that when you have motion, the last thing you want to do is have your camera miss 2 or 3 seconds. And so that's why the resolution will stay no matter what mode you're in. So setting up this camera, if my camera had audio, which the new wedges all do, this would give you the choice of video or video and audio. The video and audio is nice, but also, and I don't know about Alaska, but here you have to remove the expectation of privacy, so you do need to post if you're going to record audio, and there's a little bit more legal requirement. So if you are going to say, hey, video and audio, just make sure you're complying with whatever law you have. We actually had a recent one here where even the police did a sting and accidentally recorded audio without telling people, and like half the cases ended up getting thrown out because they had audio on their video and they couldn't use the video anymore for evidence. So just be aware of whatever rules you guys have if you're going to record audio. Pick your resolution. Most people do as high a resolution as they can. However, one thing that I always talk about is I refer to it as pixels per foot, and that's kind of your general rule of thumb as far as how much resolution you really need. And where this comes into account for the most is like at a front door. So if you're using 4 megapixel cameras and everybody says, hey, great, I want the highest resolution, a front door, you might only be recording an area, 10 feet wide. So if your resolution is 1920 by 1080, you're just about 200 pixels per foot. And a rule of thumb for like face, to be able to identify a face or a license plate is 100 pixels per foot. So even at 2 megapixel, at a front door where you're only looking at an area 10 feet wide, you have more than enough resolution. So doing that front door at 4 megapixel for 10 feet wide is really overkill. And now you're running more processing power, taking up more hard drive when you're really not getting as much benefit of it. So a lot of times when you're deciding what resolution to use, you got to take a look at how wide of an area you're looking at, and whether or not you're trying to get facial recognition or just general surveillance, and there might be reasons to not do the highest resolution. In general, I would always leave this at the bit rate at variable. Again, kind of the 95% rule. There are some reasons you might end up changing it, but I wouldn't get into those until you start talking to tech support about a special application. Here's your choices for video quality as far as your compression. Now this can be changed. So if I'm going to set something up, in general, this is a way that a lot of systems get set up, is you might take your time lapse and say, I'm going to record a couple frames per second all the time, and then I'm going to bump it up when there's motion. So I might go to a medium video quality, so it's going to be compressed, and I'm going to change my frames per second down to 2. And you can see this recommended bitrate range went way down when I made those changes. It went from like 4,000 to 600. This is where you will then get longer record time overall, as long as you have less motion. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to kind of explain a little bit. One reason that I like doing this as opposed to scheduling the camera to be motion only, where there's no time lapse, is I find it's nicer for customers and users to have something that they can review rather than blank spaces. If especially in like a residential situation, you get somebody, they think they heard a noise in the backyard, they wait till morning, then they go, hey, I'm going to see what that was last night. If you have it set to motion only and there is no motion, basically you go from 11 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning and there's nothing. The customer starts wondering whether their system's really working or not. Hey, what did it miss? Why did it miss it, etc. If you have 1 or 2 frames per second on the time lapse, if they really want to, they can go back through and play the entire night and see that nothing happened. And so it gives them a little bit more peace of mind that they didn't miss anything. So, but that's kind of a decision that you guys can make, and as you play with it, you'll kind of come up with the way you guys like programming it. And as long as you're comfortable with it, there's not really a right or wrong answer. Once you've got this saved for your time lapse, as I mentioned, I'm going to skip the time lapse low. I'm going to go to the event. So now I say, hey, I'm only recording 2 frames per second, but when I have an event, I actually want to get something that I can use. So I'm going to bump it up to the highest video quality, because as long as there's motion, I want good image quality. 30 frames per second is still quite high, so I'm going to drop that down. Anywhere between 7 and 15 is pretty good. You're getting a little bit of stutter, but for the most part, it's fluid. You're not missing anything, and it looks pretty good. So I'm going to just kind of split the middle here. I'm going to go 12 frames per second, and I'm going to save that. That's really the setup for setting up how you're going to record. Now we know that when there's time lapse, it's going to be 2 frames per second. When there's motion, it's going to jump up the quality and it's going to go to 12 frames per second. I skipped over the alarm, but again, you could do something different. So if your alarm was a panic button, you may want to jump it to 30 frames per second, because now you have an actual event that somebody is really concerned about, that you really want to get the most resolution that you can, or sorry, the highest frame rate, the highest resolution, etc. You want it to be the most everything, because it's not a bug on the lens or something that might be a random motion event, but it's an actual activated trigger. I'm going to kind of skip ahead here. So we got our video, we got our resolution. This is just kind of showing some of the different resolutions that you have: 5 megapixel, 3 megapixel, 2, and on down, and showing kind of the different areas that are covered. Skipped over that. The video quality, basically, like I said, it's not something that we have a set calculation for. It's just the highest is going to have the highest quality, is going to have the least compression. And you can see a difference as you kind of walk test some of these things. You could try it in medium, try it in highest, and see how those different images look. Frame rate. Oops, let me go back one here. So maximum bit rate, you may have noticed this back on that other screen. This is, oops, wrong calculator. The maximum bit rate is when you have the, this is where you're kind of limiting the camera based on how much throughput you want to use. In the case of this recorder, this is a little 4-channel recorder, so I only have 20 megabits that I'm allowed to play with. And as you see here, if I try to go 30 frames per second, it's recommending that my bit rate is somewhere between 6 and 8,000. Well, if I have 4 cameras, I can't do 4 cameras at 8,000. And so the maximum bit rate will have to be, total will have to be lower than 20. So it's gonna be limited that way, but you can increase it if you're doing less cameras. So in this case, I have 2 cameras set up, so I could change my maximum bit rate to 8192 as long as I only have my 2 cameras. Now, if I try to add a 3rd and 4th camera, it will not let me do the maximum bit rate. And bit rate is everything with IP cameras. So as far as, I say I have a 16 channel recorder, I can do 16 channels, but if I don't have the bit rate to do it, I'm going to be limited by how much bandwidth I have. So that is kind of the most important number, and you saw that in the calculator. As I changed my parameters, you saw what bit rate they were saying that camera was going to use. And so that's all part of the calculation for which recorder and how many cameras you can use when you're setting that up. That one's a little bit trickier, but it really is. If I go with a lower max bit rate than the recommended down here, basically what's going to happen is that that camera is going to use higher compression, even though I haven't asked it to do higher compression. It will automatically increase that compression to keep the bit rate lower. Copy to camera. You may have noticed this. This is very important. Only use this if you are using kits where you have all cameras the exact same. It can cause a lot of problems if you're using cameras that are different versions, different styles, different models, because they all have slightly different parameters, and if you try to copy, it can cause a little bit of chaos. I've had actually a dealer that had an issue of copying across versions, and it took a lot to troubleshoot because I didn't know that they were using this feature, and it took a while to figure out what happened. So where you can use this is if you are setting up a bunch of cameras and like on the kit where you end up with 6 of the exact same model number, you can go ahead and take all those parameters and copy them to other cameras in the system. So that's actually the first step of the program of the setup. The next step is quite frankly one of the easiest, and that is telling the recorder what you want, when you want it to act in what mode. The easiest way is the way I've talked about setting it up, where you've got 2 frames per second in time lapse and then maybe 10 frames per second in motion, and that is because the schedule is entirely time lapse. And let me just show you what this looks like. So this is just saying Monday through Sunday, midnight to midnight, it's time lapse high all the time. The key to remember is that as you go lower, the event and the alarm, those are a higher level activity than time lapse. So if you have the schedule set to time lapse, you will get time lapse. You will also get events, and you will also get alarms. Because those are higher level events. If I change this schedule and I say, hey, Monday through Sunday, midnight to midnight, I'm going to set this all to event, I would get events and I would get alarms, but I would get no time lapse. And then on down the line, if I set it for alarm, I would get nothing but alarms. So if you're doing it the setup the way I kind of in this example, you would just leave it at time lapse high and you're done. You don't have to change anything. Again, this is like the other one. You can do it by camera. So if there was a single camera that you said, hey, I only want this one to record on motion, you could do that, and you could leave the others as time lapse. But again, if you leave it at time lapse, you will still get events and you will still get alarms. And that's what kind of makes it fairly easy, is that I'd say 90% of the applications, people just leave this and they just leave it as time lapse and they don't worry about changing it. If you do want to change it, you just hit edit. You can either change an entire day, or you can change this to segment record, and you can pick up to 8 different time slots to change. And then you can copy to different days of the week. So this is what it looks like if you've changed it entirely to event. Here is an example of showing midnight to 8 a.m., 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 6 p.m. to midnight, and they're changing modes. So Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., you've got time lapse, and then the rest of the time you've got event. Most people don't get into this kind of minutia as far as setting up events and schedules, but you can. So I'm not going to really go through that on the recorder. That is something that's pretty self-explanatory as long as you know where you need to change it. figuring out how to set those schedules is pretty straightforward. And I'll just kind of go into that real quick. That is down here on the recording menu item, and it's the recording schedule. And you can see here's my unit, here's my second camera, and if I want to edit, that's that screen that you were looking at. Oops, did I lose it? There we go. So we kind of went through this, but I'll kind of slide through these slides pretty quick. This is talking about how you select your recording settings. Biggest thing you would use is that TVN calculator to figure out what's going to work for you. And as I mentioned, everything's all about bit rate. Bit rate is how much traffic is going. I don't really love some of these slides, so I'm going to kind of fly through some, but essentially, the bit rate that we see is listed as kilobits per second, which equals 1 megabit. Your network capacity is almost never going to be an issue on these systems. It's always going to be the hard drive and the processing power of the recorder. One thing to know, just to be a little careful of, as you can see, this is actually a decent little table. If you have a 4 terabyte hard drive on your recorder, some of that is being used for operating system, so your usable is 3.7 terabytes. Sorry, 4 terabyte, 3.7 terabyte. The big thing to know about there is really if you have a customer that is really concerned about length of time they're going to have recording. A lot of people will say, hey, I want about 2 weeks, but if somebody has regulatory reasons, like for instance, as I mentioned, the marijuana stuff, here in Washington, you have to record 10 frames per second for 45 days. And less than 45 days gets you a strike on your license and you can lose your license. So at that point, knowing this hard drive kind of headroom that you need is really important, because you don't want to plan on having 32 terabytes if dropping down to 29 terabytes means that you go from 45 days to 42 days, because that's not going to be acceptable. So that's something to just know about, that you do have a little bit of headroom in your storage. We kind of talked about all this stuff. We talked about the tool. We already went through that. I definitely recommend getting that tool and having it on your laptops, especially for the sales guys, to be able to kind of figure out some of the things that customers are going to want to know ahead of time. So we talked about how you want the cameras to be recorded in whichever mode they're in. We also talked about setting up the schedule. The third part of this is, for the most part, most cameras are going to have some sort of motion detection. So we need to set that up. Again, they're camera independent. You can set up different areas in each recorder. This is another one that I can't quantify too much. You do kind of have to walk test your different motion detection settings just to see what's going to work for you. But basically, you pick what area in the camera you want to look for, and it is looking for pixel change. The key here is if you're dealing with an outdoor camera, you could have the sun go behind a cloud, you could have a bushes move, you could have headlights sweep across a wall. All those things will change your pixels and will create a motion event. And that's one of the things that gets a little tricky when you start doing email notification and push notifications, is you have to know the area and make sure that you have a pretty stable environment that's not going to just be triggering events all the time. I'm actually going to do this on the unit itself here. So, motion in our camera setup, motion detection. So, camera 1, you see the screen. There's me talking on the headset. First thing we got to do is enable the motion detection. Without that, if I don't enable motion detection, none of that stuff that I did earlier that says, hey, when there's motion, I want you to go to 10 frames per second. If I don't enable motion detection for this, none of it's going to happen. The second thing I need to do is, after enabling it, is I need to tell it what to look for. Right now, I've enabled it, but there is no part of this screen that it's looking for motion. So I come over here and hit Start Draw, and maybe I care about when somebody walks by this area right here. So I am now looking for motion in this area right here. And then the sensitivity, that is where you're going to need to do some walk testing. I find a lot of times in outdoor area, 1 and 2 is probably going to be plenty. In a very stable indoor area, you might want it a little bit more sensitive. That's it for motion. Again, I want to scroll down though and hit save. It's a little tricky. I've got the zoom set a little weird on this computer. But now I could go to camera 2, and again, I need to enable motion detection. Maybe on this one, all I care about is, well, there's somebody walking by. All I care about is right here in this area. Scroll down and hit save. So once you've got motion detection set up, now you've got kind of the triumvirate where you've got your time lapse going for all the time. When somebody trips the motion, then that's going to change your settings on the motion. Let me just go back here real quick. One thing you'll notice is this unit's a little bit slower. You can actually see that the motion is a little bit more stuttered than on the other camera, and that's because we've changed the settings on camera 1. We set it to the 12 frames per second, whereas camera 2 I never got into, so it's still at the default of 30 frames per second. This is one of the other differences between the HD-TVI and the IP systems. The IP systems with the HDMI that's out of the back, the images that will be shown are whatever mode the camera is in. So if the camera is set to record 2 frames per second on time-lapse and the camera is in time-lapse mode, your HDMI output will show 2 frames per second. If it's in motion and it is set for 12 frames per second, it will show 12 frames per second. So the HDMI out is always going to show what is being recorded. On a TVI, your HDMI out is going to show high resolution, real time, all the time. So even if you set a camera to say record at D1 resolution for 2 frames per second in time lapse, if that camera is in time lapse, your HDMI out of the recorder is still going to show 1080p real time. So for a public view monitor, that type of application, that is a real big benefit of the TVI, is always showing high resolution real time. Let me pop back here. One thing I am going to show you that's not on this slide, oh, you know what? Actually, sorry, I need to show you one more thing. This is one step of showing email notifications and or push notifications that you were asking about. Motion detection by camera has this actions tab, and you can do different things, like you can have the camera come up full screen or pull in audio, and but here is your send an email or notify alarm host. Notify alarm host is not only sending an alarm to a software that's running on a server that you could use, it also is responsible for sending the push notifications to an app. The app needs to be turned on the phone, and the push notifications needs to be turned on. But this way you could make it so that only 1 or 2 cameras pushed to the phone and not every one of them. Some people will do that for just the front door camera, but they're not going to push notifications for the backyard camera, something like that. Another thing while we're in here, just to show you, I can, with the motion from camera 1, I could trigger recording on other channels. So if you had cameras all the way around the house, maybe you have one camera that has so much going on that you really can't use the motion detection on it, you could use the motion detection from other cameras to trip that camera. Not used very often, but it is something that's able to be done. I'm going to check that right now and make sure to save. Second thing I'm going to show you that and this kind of relays is in part to the email notifications or the alarm notifications, is the product called VCA, and you'll see this down here. And this is a little bit different. VCA is, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's basically a light version of analytics, where motion detection is just looking at pixel change in an area. VCA allows you to do things like a cross line, meaning, hey, an object crossed over a certain line. Like at a front door, you could use that on the walkway up to the door. So it gives you a little bit less sensitive setup, but you can still do things like send the push notifications. The difference between VCA alarms is I can enable the VCA alarm here. In the action, I can say, "Hey, push to the app," and I can save this. However, I need to go into the camera itself to actually create this cross line. So I've told the VCR, or the recorder on IP camera 1, enable VCA, and what we're looking for is a cross line. But until I go into the camera and turn that on, it's not gonna do any good. This is something a little bit newer. It's actually been around, but they haven't really talked about it, and I think it's a pretty powerful thing. It's in all of their cameras in a basic level. Some of these, all the basic cameras have crossline, and I believe in TruVision, and there's all these other things that some of the higher end cameras have, but even on their most basic kit cameras, you can do the crossline detected. So let me, what we're going to do is I need to get into this camera to show you activating the VCA. And this is going to kind of bump us ahead to another part of this about getting into the cameras. So if you're familiar with networking, obviously you realize that I've plugged those cameras into the back of my recorder, and the recorder is acting as a router. So if I go back to my IP camera status, you'll see that this is 254.6 and this is 254.7. Well, because I'm on a .2 network, I am not, obviously I can't go to those cameras directly. But here's one little trick of these. So I'm on the network with the recorder. If I click on this IP address, you'll see it actually takes me to the IP address of the recorder, port 65001. That's kind of a way for you to get to the cameras even though you're not on the subnet with those cameras. And that's something that you can go to directly. You don't have to go to that page and click on it. You could actually just go to the address of the recorder and then port 65001, obviously 65002 for camera 2, on and on and on. And the nice thing about that is that these cameras do have some capabilities that are not accessible from the recorder. One of those being the VCA. So you can see here I'm logged into the camera itself rather than into the recorder. The important thing to note is at this point, I do not want to start changing these parameters here, because these parameters here are being controlled by the recorder. So you don't want to start messing with these on the camera side. You want to leave those for the recorder to adjust. And then, but what you can do, let me see. Okay, is go into the image screen of the camera, and I have many more controls here than I did from the recorder. One of the most important ones is my backlight settings. Most of these cameras have wide dynamic range. That allows you to prevent backlighting. So front door cameras, things like that. If I turn off the backlight compensation, you see how the lights behind me are blacking me out quite a bit. If I turn back on wide dynamic range, you'll see this didn't get too bright, but it brought this level up quite a bit so that you can actually see somebody standing in a backlight situation. Really important feature to turn on in most applications, especially outdoor, but you can only get to it from the camera. So again, that's one more reason to go to this the 65001 to get into the camera. What I wanted to show you though first was the smart event. That's what they call the VCA. So I must have already turned this on for some other demo, but here's our cross line. I've enabled the cross line. I think you can do 4 lines, but here's line 1. And I've drawn a line across this little entryway, and you can see that I've actually said that I only care about from A to B. So I'm only looking for people coming from this area into this area. I can do the opposite, or I can do both directions. And then you also have a sensitivity. And you can tell it to only arm that at certain times. Since this was already there, I'm not going to save it, but this is a good way if you have somebody that really wants push notifications. You probably want to consider doing that with VCA rather than with just motion detection. I just think you're going to get too many false trips on motion detection. Let me close out of here. Oops. There's one other thing on that VCA that I wanted to show you. In your event setup, in this notifications tab, if you're doing both motion and VCA, you have to pick whether motion is more important than VCA or if VCA is more important than motion. Most people are going to pick, you want the VCA to actually override the motion, but you have to pick that. So I'm going to save that as, hey, my VCA events are going to be more important than motion. Oops. Get back here. So now we're talking about remote access. So we've got the recording. At this point, you could walk away, and your recorder is recording when you want. It's tripping. It's setting up motion events. You know, you're recording, and you have security. But as you know, most people, part of their security is they want to be able to log into these things remotely and take a look at their cameras anytime. So you can actually look at these cameras with three ways. You can either do a browser. Again, you're stuck to Internet Explorer or some sort of emulator. TVR Mobile, which is the app that we talked about that you have on your phone, or TruVision Navigator software. And TruVision Navigator is a very big piece of software that can do a lot, but it's no charge as long as you just want to view cameras and export video. So that's a very important thing to know about and make sure that your customers know about it. It is only available in PC, whereas the browser, you can get that with a Mac plugin. So you can use the browser on a Mac. To see things remotely, you're going to need to port forward on the router, and then most likely you're going to use the DDNS to give it a network name. The ports. So the default ports that you're going to forward when you're setting up your router are 8000 is the server port, and that is for your app or TruVision Navigator software. 80 is the HTTP port, so that's your web port, that's for your browser. And then 554 is the RTSP service port, which is for the video. All of those ports can be changed right here. So if you were to look at many of my demo systems here, I actually changed those ports to like 8700, 8702, and 8704. I keep them in a grouping so that when I go to my router, because I have about 5 different servers on this network, but when I go to the router, I can actually just forward a group of ports rather than forwarding individuals. But if you leave it as the default, you can go ahead and forward these 3 ports, and you will have remote access to your system. Talks about those a little bit. So this is kind of the one tricky part. All routers are going to be a little bit different. So this is showing one system where they said, where they actually, here's the demo right here. They were forwarding port 80, port 8000, and then they actually changed the RTSP port to 1024. So they have all 3 of these, and they point to their IP address and the 110. I will pull up mine here. Oops. Let's see. So here's my router that I have in my demo area. If I go to my network address translation and port forwarding, here is that same table. You can see that I have .82. This is what I normally switch these ports to. So I am not using, it's not the default ports, but you see here I have a TVN 10, I have a TVN 21 that's using different ports. I have, well, this 1208 is actually a 1508, but that's these ports. So I basically changed ports for each different recorder, and I forward those ports to whatever the internal IP address is of my recorder. Oops, I'm gonna switch that. There we go. Unfortunately, with a bunch of different devices out there, that's about the extent of the help that I can give on this without seeing an individual router. There is a good resource out there called portforward.com that basically allows you to look up a router by model number, and it should help with the information that you need to change port forwarding for that particular router. I have a lot of dealers actually that use a specific router, and there's a couple of them that basically as part of their CCTV package, they essentially say, hey, if we're going to remotely access your recorder, we're going to switch your router to the one that I use. And that way they don't have to learn 100 different customers' routers. UPnP, this is actually a piece that is built into the recorder, and this is kind of an auto port forwarding, and where the recorder will talk to the router and get port forwarding set up automatically. If you're familiar with it and are comfortable with it, it is supported. I am not as comfortable with this as some, and I don't necessarily recommend using it. And the main reason is that while the auto UPnP is great, if you end up with a conflict or something that's happening that you're not able to figure out, it doesn't show in your router tables, and so it can be very hard to troubleshoot. So if you're comfortable with it and it works for you, great. It'll do it. It'll work. However, if there's any issues, it might be a little tough to find. So I don't recommend using UPnP, but it is there if you or your IT people are like it and want to use it. Oops. Lastly is the DDNS. So we talked about the DNS service, which is basically so that it can translate the names, and the DDNS is so that you can actually give your recorder a name and find it without knowing what the exact IP address of your system is. This is a DDNS service that is built into the unit and is hosted by Interlogix. They are actually paying right now a third party to host their DDNS, and any time I would expect within the next month or so, they're rolling this over to an actual hosted service by them. It should be fairly transparent from a device standpoint, but this is currently how you set these things up, and this may change here in a little bit. But let me get into the configuration. So for the DDNS, we go back to our network settings and DDNS. So if I want to enable the DDNS, just check the box. Easy DDNS is the one that's hosted by Interlogix. You can, if you have an account with these other companies, you could use these. But the nice thing about Easy DDNS is it doesn't require setting up any kind of an account. All it's going to do is it's going to look at the MAC address of this recorder, and as long as you choose a host name that's not been used, it will give that to you, and then you can use that name when you're accessing the unit remotely. A couple things. This is for a web setup. You cannot start with a number, and you cannot use capital letters or symbols. So you're limited to letters and numbers, and you need to start with a letter. Basically, to activate it, you enable it here. If I choose a host name and I say home, that's obviously a very common name you cannot duplicate. So the one tricky part about this screen is you don't use this get URL tab. That's for after the fact if you come back to this page after you've done programming. When you are initially setting it up, you type in your host name and then you hit save. I don't know if you can see this, but popped up a window saying get URL from DDNS server failed. Please check the setting of this parameter. So basically it's telling me that's not going to work. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you any more information than that, but it just says that's not going to work. So now I have one of two options that are the most common errors. Either I did something wrong here, which in my case I know that home is just way too common of a name, or it could come up that way if you don't have DNS information typed in. Well, I know I have DNS information, so now I just need to pick a trickier host name that won't be taken. And so maybe I say, hey, I'm going to take group 1, and I'm going to say our phone number. So that's probably not taken unless I've set it up on one of my other demo systems. Now when I hit save, it says save successful, and I think this one is not showing, but it says it's a pop-up window that says registering domain successful. So at this point, I now have my host name set up, and here is my new URL for remote access. So if you type in, and actually I have to change my ports to match my port forwarding, but if you type in group 1 454.9900.tvr-ddns.net, you can get into the demo system. And actually, I'm going to let you get into mine when we get into the remote stuff. So I am going to change this to my normal setup, which is 8702. Oh, I forgot. That's why I didn't do that. Okay. Well, that's actually going to reboot now because I changed the ports. Once you change the ports, you have to reconnect on a network level. So it's got to reboot. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation here. That's kind of it as far as the remote access. We've got it set up, and I'll kind of go into the software here in just a second. But so we set up the cameras, we set up the recording type, we set up the schedules, we set up your motion and your VCA. We then set up the remote access with the ports and the port forwarding. And I think we've already gone through these tips. I mentioned that the cameras aren't accessible through the network, so you have to go through that link or use that that port 65001. That's how you can get into those cameras directly. That method of being able to get into those cameras directly, there is a setting called Bridge PoE Camera Network. It defaults on, and as long as that is checked, that will allow you to see those cameras. If for some reason on a security standpoint you don't want to see those cameras, you can uncheck that so that path is not open. We talked about that. Logging into the cameras. Here's those little tips that I was talking about the TVI setup, that the resolution can be changed, and you also get your high def. That's the end of the presentation, and I will now get into the software. Do you have any questions up until this point? Okay, So one thing I just was showing. So if you change your HTTP port on your recorder, which I changed it to 8700, you need to type in the IP address and then colon 8700, and that'll get you to the recorder. Email and text pushes. Okay, so as far as the email, I'm going to get into that first. Basically, there is a setup, and I'm going to actually send you a document when I get off here about setting up Gmail and Yahoo. But the network settings for email. This is where you set up the email capabilities for the recorder. Let's see. Just want to make sure. Okay. So I'm going to send you a document about Gmail. All of these will be a little bit different. Yahoo, any of these. You do have your server authentication. You have to figure out your port. With Gmail, they've gone to a two-factor authentication, and it walks through setting up that two-factor authentication, and then you can get yourself an appliance password, which is like a 16-digit number, and you'll use that to set up the sending of emails. And I'm not going to go through that here because there is a little bit of setup, but I've got a document that'll show you setting up your send email. Once you have it as a send email, then you set up who's going to get these emails. So you can do up to 3 people getting them, and you'll set up, whoever's going to get that address and where it's going to come from. As I showed you on the motion detection and the VCA, when you go to activities, one of your options is send email. So if you set up an email and you want this to be a text push, it's going to be the phone number at, and then whatever the service provider. So like Verizon is vtext.com, AT&T is, I think it's like att.worldnet.net. You can look that up online, and they actually do have a list of all the different cell providers, and that'll change that email into a text. Now I'll tell you that this is kind of the downside of the emails. The emails get set up in the system. You click on the send email. Once it's set up, it's going to be pushing those emails on all those activities. And so if you have a singular event that you're looking for, or it's raining and it's an outdoor camera and you've got IRs hitting the rain, you will get a lot of emails. And there's no easy way to shut that off. You really have to come into the configuration of the recorder and uncheck send email. Whereas push notifications on the app, the user can actually turn those on and off. So might as well go to the app right now. So if you go to your TruVision app and your TVR mobile app, you can actually log into, I just want to make sure I did the right ports. Whoops. Oh no, hold on. Oh yeah, okay, I gotta switch these ports again. Sorry, I picked 8700, but it's actually 8300 that I need. And I think that's going to reboot again when I save that. Okay, so now you'll be able to log into this recorder once it comes back up online. Do you have the app set up and ready to go? Okay, so that's back up and running. So if you've got your app, we can get this demo system plugged in, and I can kind of show you that that push notification. Oops. Ah,
Can
there we
you
go.
hear me?
Yep, now I can. Do you want me to
Okay.
give you a call? Because this one's probably going to take a little bit more interaction. Or
For
actually,
sure.
you know what? You're coming through okay now. Earlier, I was having a
Okay.
lot of trouble hearing you. So, do you have your the app on your phone that you want to plug in the information for this recorder?
I'm all set up. Group 1454990 is the host name. I just need the password.
Yep. So use admin,
Yep.
and then use it's L1 L capital Y, and then
Yeah.
12031, and your port needs to be changed to 8302.
Okay. It looks like it's working. Actually, I didn't have to change any ports or anything. So I see you.
Oh, oh yeah. You know what? Sorry, I forgot. That's one thing actually I didn't mention. When you're doing the DDNS, it will actually save that port info. It sends the port information to the DDNS server as well. So you
Cool.
don't need to identify a port. Okay, so you've got that recorder pulled up. So
Yeah.
if you go to if you hit the little like three lines, the menu in the upper left.
Yeah.
The fourth icon over is the little alarm bell.
Yeah.
And so it says set alarm notification.
Yep.
If you click on that, now you have a list of your devices, and you can turn on the alarms on one of your devices.
Okay.
And I don't know if I can get this thing tripped. I can't remember if we set it up just as motion or not. Um,
I'm just gonna sit right next to you.
and that will push notifications. The nice thing about the push notifications is that, as you saw with turning them on, you can turn them on and off. So like if you have something on the front porch that you're worried about, hey, somebody's going to deliver a package, you could have the push notifications on, and then when that package gets delivered and you're kind of set, you can turn them off again. So
Okay.
you're not constantly getting bombarded. And let me, whoops, caps lock.
What does it mean when you can't get the push token?
What's that?
What does it mean when you can't get the push token? That's the message I'm getting right now.
So probably go into the phone settings. If you're like me, you may have set the
I,
set it up to say don't allow notifications.
that would be it.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that happen. That's one of them. Like, anytime you add an app, it always asks you for all these things. And I always say no, 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 no. And then the
Of
two
course.
things you'll run into is the notifications. And then
Oh, yeah.
also, if in the app you're ever looking at something and you want to save a snapshot, there's another
Mm-hmm.
authorization that you need to give it, like, I think it's like authorization to use photos or something like that you may not have.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, I have to save for the photos. Cool. Okay, so yeah, that worked. I turned notifications on and now it works.
And so did you get the little notification then, the little pop-up?
Well, yeah, it said it successfully did it.
Okay. No, but I mean, like, is it showing in that alarm section? Is it showing you that that there's a notification? I don't know if you were connected when somebody walked by and we
Oh
got a.
no, I don't have a notification there. No,
Okay.
no alarm information.
Okay. Hold on just a second.
Oh, there you go.
So you should have gotten one just then.
Yeah, so I put remote playback, and that's just current right now. Let's see again. So remote playback should show what you just did, right? To activate that alarm.
It puts you in playback mode. Well, let's see. It puts you in playback mode. I don't know that it takes you back to that event. And the problem
So
is
I just have to drag back.
yeah, the problem, and one problem I'm having with figuring out is that it does take the recorder like a couple minutes to process video. So in other words, it's recording the video, it's getting it onto the thing, but it's recording in a certain segment of the hard drive, and you're not able to access that instantly. In other words, it's got to get processed
Sure.
through and figure out. And so I was just talking to somebody just the other day about this. You can't. You're not going to be like if you get an alarm and you go to playback, you're not going to be playing back that 30 seconds ago. It takes probably about a minute to 2 minutes before it's actually processed and ready for playback.
I gotcha. Okay.
The one thing I will tell you on this, on the alarm notifications, and this is a difference in the types of app. iPhone will give you those notifications in your push notification screen. Like if you've got the app closed, it'll show you, hey, you got an event.
Yeah.
Android, the app needs to be running in the background to get those notifications.
Okay.
I don't know why. I don't have an Android, so I'm not sure of kind of the technical differences, but it does need to be in the background.
Okay.
So that's the push notifications. And did you have any other questions on the app? Like I said, the app is very, very close to kind of being redone as part of that DDNS update.
Great. Okay.
But
I'm glad because no offense, it is kind of a clunky, not super easy to use application.
yeah, once you get used to, so it's a little bit simple. Once you get used to it, it's pretty straightforward. The problem is, in my mind, that they have all these icons that you don't know necessarily what they are. Since we're on here, just to kind of go through it with you, if you pull up any of these cameras, the camera is basically your snapshot. The joystick is if you have a PTZ on the system so that you can actually move the camera around. The little window pane is what I call it. That's your difference between main and sub. And you will, on this system that you're logged into, you're not going to see as much of a difference because these are 720p cameras, but or 1.3 megapixel. But if you start getting into like 4 megapixel cameras, the difference in speed with how they process between sub and main is huge. And when you're looking at them on a small image like a phone, SubStream is usually pretty darn good, and will pull up a lot quicker. The little boxes with an X is just to disconnect off the cameras. And then if you hit the little 3 dots to scroll over to your other menu items, you've got audio to listen in to the microphone on the camera, which these don't have, but some of the newer cameras do. There is a microphone for actually pushing out audio. That it takes a little bit more getting used to because you actually have to have an amplifier and a speaker, and I don't have as many people doing that. The alarm button is actually kind of an interesting one. The little bell with a arrow on it. You see that one?
Yeah.
The back of the recorder has an alarm output. So, and it's only one. So even though it's a 4-channel or an 8-channel recorder, you only have one output. But you can actually activate and deactivate from your app. So for a light version of home automation, if you had the output from this recorder, you could have that go to you could have it go to a trigger of like a voice driver that says, hey, get off my property. If you've got like a remote property and you want to see this, you could actually trigger that remotely while you're looking at it. Or you could use it to turn on lights with some sort of automation. Basically, use your imagination and you can do lots of stuff.
Yeah. It's just using the contact closure on the back of that?
Exactly. It's just a contact closure. So whatever you can think of to use a contact closure for, you can trigger it remotely.
Okay, cool.
And then
so we have an MVR 10 or MVI or something like that. I don't know the exact number.
Okay.
But can I set that up to have like a switch on the door so when someone walks through it records, or
Yeah, so
or
that
does
would be
anything like that?
so that would be the alarm. So when we went through, I'm going to get in here. So um, when we went in our camera recorder, so we got our time lapse and we had our event,
Yeah.
and then we have our
Yeah, sure.
alarm. So if you set your alarm for whatever you set it for, and then
Yeah.
you'd wire it up to the back, and then that alarm would get logged as an alarm.
Okay.
And that way you would have a difference. One, you'd have a difference of how it's recording, but even if you had it
Uh-huh.
as the same recording, that even if you had them set for 10 frames per second for both, the benefit is that then in your playback here, you would actually have a red slash showing that you had motion. So here's our thing, right? So you've got let me expand this a little bit. Oh shoot, this thing is blocking. Okay, there we go. So you've got green is your time lapse,
Well, we
yellow is
don't
your.
see anything here.
Oh, sorry, I forgot what
No
I'm.
worries.
Yeah, let me. There. See it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So green is your time lapse, yellow is your motion, blue or
Hmm.
purple is your VCA recording, that little trip line that I was talking about. And then in your
Uh-huh.
case, with a door window switch or something, you'd have red, which would be your alarm recording.
Do you guys sell one of those to be installed and integrated in the system?
A door switch?
Yeah.
Are you talking about wireless or hardwired?
Either one.
I mean, hardwired, we've got tons of door switches. That's very
Okay.
easy. I mean, that normally what we would do, but I mean, you can do whatever, but normally what we would do is the switch would actually be wired to an alarm system, and then you would take an
Yeah.
output from the alarm system into the recorder. But
Sure.
if you wanted to run a switch right into the back of the recorder, no problem.
That's what I
Uh,
wanted to do, just since that's what we have right now.
what's that?
Since that is all we have right now, that's what I wanted to do, just to try it out and
Oh, sure.
use it. That was something my boss was interested
Yeah,
in.
that's very easy to do. Um, what I wanted to show you kind of last, which is also part of this push notifications, is can you see the screen still, the TruVision Navigator software?
Yep.
So this is downloadable. It's free. Uh, this is what allows you to either you have a customer that has like 4 branches of something like like an oil change place or whatever. They
Mm.
can actually load all of their systems here. For instance, this is my demo area. So I've got a TVN 21, I have a
Mm.
TVR 15, and here's my TVN 10, which may or may not load up because I've just done all this programming here. I think I've got it back to yep. So I can now take camera 1 from this recorder, camera whatever from
Hmm.
this recorder, camera whatever from this recorder, and I can show them all at the same time. So if I'm a business owner with multiple branches, I can show all the front counters. I can do all sorts of stuff without logging in, logging back out, and checking everything out. So
Great.
this is free, downloadable. It will come up saying that you need a license. That is only for some of these more advanced features that you see here. That red is actually a padlock because this is not a licensed copy. And that's
Uh-huh.
like integrating with the access control.
Okay.
Um, and one thing just to show, because mine is kind of grandfathered in a little bit, this is what you can get with the integration. So I have actually labeled cameras on here, and this
Uh-huh.
is the Interlogix access control system, of which I've added a door. And if I right click here, I actually can unlock, reinstate, open, do all sorts of stuff. So you could have, this being like an outside camera, somebody rings the doorbell, you have TruVision Navigator, somebody sitting at their desk goes, oh yeah, there you go, I can see that's the UPS guy, and they could go over
Yeah.
here and say, open, come on in, bring the stuff in. And you kind of have this integrated package, but that's kind of a premium thing for the TruVision Navigator. But even if you let the license lapse, the trial license, all of the video stuff is all free, and you can use this to review video and pull it up. As
Cool.
far as setting it up, it's basically the same thing as what you just did with the TVR mobile. you would just come in here and right click and say add device, and you just
Okay.
basically type in the same information.
Cool.
And lastly, real quick, I don't know what you're on time frame. I don't want to rush you, but I know we said about 2.5 hours, so I don't want to keep you long. But when you have the video here, this is a lot easier to store and export video than using the browser. So I've got my timeline along the bottom. I can, with a scroll wheel, I can explode this out so that it is a little easier to see. But with these little brackets right here, that's where I can identify, hey, I want to export from here to here. And once I have that labeled, I hit this little film strip and it throws it in this thing called the collector. And the nice thing is on the browser, if I were to want to export 5 minutes from this camera, 2 minutes from this other camera, 30 seconds from another camera, each time I go to export, I now have to wait for the video to be pulled off the recorder. With this, I can find all the different clips that I want. Each time I hit save, it just bookmarks the clip. And you basically come up with a big list of clicks. And then all at once I can say, hey, export all this video. Which if you're looking to export 30 seconds, no big deal. If you're looking to export, 35 minutes of all sorts of different cameras, it can take a while to actually pull it off the hard drive. And so it's nice to be able to collect it all and then export it all at once. The second thing is when you do that, you can see all these little clips, 32 megabytes, 74 megabytes, etc. It shows you how much space you're going to need on whatever thumb drive you want to use to pull that off.
Great.
So that's kind of what I've got. I know you were interested in that push notification. I hope that showed it well enough. And I think that as far as the email goes, the document kind of walks through setting up Gmail with it. And so I'll make sure to get you over that document because I think that's that'll explain that a little bit more. But I think because of the ability to turn it on and off, I think the push notifications on the app tends to be a little bit better in that regard.
Yeah, it seems so. I think people are more are used to that.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the file types. When you download or when you export these to your computer, what file type are they in?
Let me do this. Probably can't see what I'm doing, but I'll get you back in here in just a second.
Okay.
Okay, so you're looking at, so this is the folder that I've got that is from TruVision Navigator. So it's a .video file. Technically, I'm not sure what it is. These are all watermarked. So these are a non-manipulatable file. And when you export them into whatever folder, if that folder does not have the player, it will download this player for you. And it'll put it on there.
Okay.
So basically, if I take this folder and I put it on a thumb drive, I've got the player and I've got the video, and I can watch it back, and it's pretty rudimentary. There is, so this is what I would call the stripped down player, because it's something that they'll put on every time. There is a TruNav player that you can download from Interlogix website that has a little bit more capabilities, and you can actually switch it from this watermarked video file to like an AVI file. But this is more your evidence capability because it's watermarked and it's not tamperable. You take an AVI file, and in theory, that's not going to be a great evidence because somebody could say it's been manipulated, etc. However, I have had people take these video files, they leave this for the for the police as the evidence, etc., and then they take it, switch it to an AVI file, and they post it to your neighborhood watch website or basically like, hey, take a look at this and help me find this guy kind of thing.
Cool. Sweet. Well, trying to think off the top of my head right now what else we were curious about. Mainly, it was just general setup, some of the details that we never got to see
Sure.
when we first started. When you guys first came up here, we really liked you guys' stuff, and we started selling it immediately and started installing it immediately. And we haven't had time to go through training like this. So
Yeah. And
appreciate
like I said,
it.
I tried to hit the really the highlights, because there are a million different menu items, but until you're in a position of using one of those items, it doesn't really do you much good, because it's just gonna go. You're just not gonna know it. What I wanted to show you, if I can find it. I was going to show you that I do have a few videos. Like one of the videos, one of the reasons we made a video on exporting video using TruVision Navigator, and the main reason is, like, I just went through it with you real quickly.
Mhm.
Inevitably, you're going to put in a system, until it's 4 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later, and the customer goes, "Oh crap, we had something happen, and I need to export it." At that point, no one remembers what you may have talked to them about at the very beginning, and setting it up. So we made a video of it. So either you can walk through it so you can help your customer, or quite frankly, if they've got Navigator and things, you can send them to it, and they can probably get it done themselves.
That's perfect. We needed that actually right now, so that's helpful.
Okay. So yeah, and like I said, I'll send you the link to our. I can't find our. This is bad, but I can't find our channel right now. So I will find that. So at this point, I owe you the document about email. I'll send you the link to that to the YouTube channel that's got the training video, and then you've got my email and number, and like I said, we're glad to help any way we can, and I do a lot of individual tech support. So feel free to give us a call.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the help.
No problem. Thanks for taking the time, guys.
Good deal, man. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.